Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to today's video. For years, Washington has spoken the language of warning to Moscow, to Tehran, to Pyongyang, but this time it was Beijing that spoke back. When the United States threatened possible military action against Nigeria, claiming that freedom of religion was under attack, China answered with an unmistakable message: don't touch it. The statement was calm, measured, and devastatingly clear, the diplomatic equivalent of a gun placed gently on the table. Mao Ning, the Chinese Foreign Ministry's spokesperson, spoke the words that now reverberate across capitals. We firmly support the leadership of President Tinubu as he guides his people along a development path suited to Nigeria's national conditions. We oppose any nation that uses religion or human rights as pretexts to interfere in the internal affairs of others. In one breath, she stripped away the moral armor that the United States has worn for decades. For Washington, Nigeria has long been more than just another country. It has been its anchor in Africa, a military partner, a diplomatic ally, a showcase for Western-style governance. But the Nigeria of today is no longer the obedient ally of yesterday. With $25 billion in Chinese investments flowing into energy, rail, and industrial projects, in 2025 alone, Nigeria is now Beijing's strategic foothold on the continent. To threaten Nigeria is to threaten China's vision for Africa, and Beijing has made it clear that it will not be tolerated. This moment is historic because it reverses a century of political gravity. For the first time in modern history, a non-Western power has told the United States publicly and directly that it has no jurisdiction over another sovereign nation. It is not the language of defiance, it is the language of authority. Beijing is no longer asking for permission to lead. It is asserting that leadership has already changed hands. The implications are seismic. If America defies this warning, the risk is not merely diplomatic embarrassment, but the ignition of a global realignment. If it backs down, it acknowledges that the age of unilateral intervention is over. Either way, the world that emerges will not resemble the one Washington built. China's message to the United States is deceptively simple, yet philosophically profound. You can no longer use morality as a weapon. You cannot save the world by ruling it. And with that sentence, the balance of moral power has shifted, not through war, but through words. The flashpoint is not in the jungles of Africa or the corridors of the Pentagon. It is in the space between arrogance and awakening, where empires first realize they are no longer feared. Nigeria stands at the center of the world's newest contest for power, not because it asked to be, but because the world's empires cannot let it stand alone. It is Africa's most populous nation, its largest economy, and its greatest experiment in democratic endurance. Yet beneath the surface of optimism lies a nation navigating a quiet revolution, a shift from dependency to sovereignty. For decades, Washington treated Nigeria as a success story of Western alignment, a partner in the war on terror, a recipient of military aid, a model of capitalist reform. Its politics were shaped by American programs, its industries by IMF prescriptions, and its priorities by U.S. diplomatic channels. But that version of Nigeria was designed to serve a global order that is now collapsing. The new Nigeria under President Bola Ahmed Tinubu is turning toward a future defined not by obedience, but by opportunity. China has become the architect of that opportunity. Its footprint in Nigeria is no longer symbolic, it is structural. $25 billion in new investments are transforming the nation's railways, power grids, and industrial zones. Solar energy plants rise where diesel generators once roared. New highways carve through regions long neglected by colonial infrastructure. These are not gifts, they are deals. and that distinction matters profoundly. For the first time, Nigeria is engaging the world not as a pupil, but as a partner. This transformation terrifies Washington. To the U.S., Nigeria's pivot toward Beijing is not just an economic shift, it is a philosophical one. It represents a rejection of the hierarchy that has defined Africa's relationship with the West, a refusal to be instructed on how to modernize, democratize, or civilize. Trump's recent threat of possible action against Nigeria disguised as concern for religious freedom was a familiar echo of the old colonial script, the missionary's plea hiding the merchant's ambition. But Nigeria today is not the Nigeria of 1985 or 1999. Its people are politically awake, its youth globally connected, and its government increasingly aware of its leverage in a world desperate for African resources and markets. Tinubu understands that in a multipolar world, loyalty is not a virtue, it is a vulnerability. The key to survival lies in balance, accepting Chinese investment without surrendering autonomy, maintaining relations with Washington without capitulation. The crossroads are clear. One path leads backward toward dependency deference and the illusion of Western benevolence. The other leads forward toward a messy, unpredictable, but self-directed sovereignty. And in choosing the latter, Nigeria is not betraying anyone. It is fulfilling the promise of independence long denied. Beijing calls it a partnership. Washington calls it betrayal. But perhaps Nigeria, weary of being told what to believe, calls it simply what it is: freedom, the kind that doesn't need permission to exist, the kind that terrifies those who once believed they owned it. In the old world order, power was projected through force armies, sanctions, and propaganda wrapped in moral conviction. But China has rewritten the manual. Its weapon is not coercion, it is restraint. Its ideology is not domination, it is sovereignty. When Mao Ning stood before the cameras and warned Washington to stay out of Nigeria, she was not merely defending an ally, she was unveiling the new doctrine of Chinese diplomacy, that every nation has the right to shape its destiny free from the sermons of empire. This is not an empty slogan. It is Beijing's answer to a century of Western interference dressed as humanitarianism. For decades, the United States perfected the art of moral manipulation using democracy, religion, and human rights as instruments of control. Nations that complied were rewarded with aid. Those that resisted were punished with sanctions or invasion. The language of virtue became the currency of power. China, in contrast, offers a mirror image of that strategy. It tells the developing world, we will not tell you how to govern, only how to grow. It replaces the politics of judgment with the economics of partnership. The message is subtle, but revolutionary morality, Beijing argues, is not the West's monopoly. Development itself can be a moral act. Lifting millions from poverty is no less ethical than preaching liberty from afar. By defending Nigeria against U.S. pressure, China is exporting this philosophy of sovereignty as both shield and sword. It presents itself as the protector of the global South, the voice of nations weary of being lectured and controlled. The irony, of course, is rich. The country once accused of authoritarianism now speaks as the champion of freedom, while the self-proclaimed defender of liberty threatens war over religion. In the theater of global politics, the roles have reversed. What makes China's approach dangerous to Washington is not its ideology, but its effectiveness. It works. Nations like Nigeria, Kenya, and Indonesia are discovering that independence is no longer lonely. It is supported, financed, and defended. Sovereignty has become a brand, and Beijing is selling it better than anyone. Yet behind China's calm confidence lies a quiet challenge. It dares the United States to live by its own words, to respect the autonomy it preaches. And that is a test Washington cannot easily pass because American foreign policy is built not on equality, but on dominance disguised as duty. So when Mounting warned the U.S. not to interfere, it wasn't just a diplomatic rebuttal. It was a declaration of the new moral order one, where power no longer hides behind principle, and principle no longer belongs to one side. In this doctrine of sovereignty, China isn't merely defending Nigeria, it is defending the idea that the age of moral empire is over, and the world, weary of hypocrisy, seems ready to listen. When Donald Trump feels challenged, he does not calculate, he reacts. His politics run on instinct, not diplomacy. So when Beijing told Washington to stay out of Nigeria, it struck him not as a geopolitical warning, but as a personal insult. For a man who equates global respect with fear, China's defiance was intolerable. What followed was predictable threats, bluster, and an attempt to turn moral outrage into political theater. Within hours of Beijing's statement, Trump's advisors drafted a response accusing China of supporting authoritarian regimes and undermining religious freedom. The irony, of course, was glaring. America, which has armed dictators and funded coups for decades, was once again invoking morality as a weapon. But Trump's base doesn't care about irony, it cares about dominance. The message was clear: the U.S. would not be lectured by Beijing, especially not about Africa, a continent Washington still considers part of its sphere of influence. Trump's reaction was driven less by policy than by pride. He has always viewed power as a zero-sum game. If China gains, America loses. The very idea of Beijing defending Nigeria's sovereignty was to him an act of provocation. And so the machinery of intimidation began to turn. Washington hinted at sanctions against Nigerian officials, suspended certain aid programs, and even floated the possibility of deploying naval assets to the Gulf of Guinea for security monitoring. In diplomatic language, this was theater disguised as deterrence. But the danger of Trump's impulsive style is that theater has consequences. By escalating a moral dispute into a strategic confrontation, he risks forcing a choice between retreat and ruin. If the U.S. backs down, it concedes ground not only to China, but to a new global principle, one it can no longer control. If it doubles down, it risks igniting a conflict in a region where America's credibility has already eroded. In either case, the myth of unquestioned U.S. authority weakens. Trump's advisors, trapped between ideology and reality, will frame the standoff as a defense of democracy. But the world sees something different, a superpower losing patience, composure, and purpose. Washington's response feels less like leadership and more like reflects the flailing of an empire that no longer understands the game it taught others to play. Beijing, meanwhile, will not respond with equal noise. It doesn't need to. Every American overreaction serves China's long game to present itself as the rational counterweight to Western aggression. The more Trump threatens, the calmer Beijing appears. The more he shouts, the smaller America looks. In the end, Trump's response will be remembered not for its strength, but for its symbolism, a portrait of an empire unable to accept a world that no longer fears it. Pride may demand confrontation, but history will remember it as the moment when American power mistook defiance for respect, and in doing so began to lose both. While the headlines scream of confrontation between Washington and Beijing, another capital is watching with the patience of a chess player, Moscow. Russia understands that global dominance is no longer achieved through invasion or occupation, but through timing. And in this crisis, timing is everything. For Vladimir Putin, the clash between China and the United States over Nigeria is an unexpected gift. It opens a new front where Russia can expand its influence without lifting a sword, while the U.S. burns diplomatic bridges and China defends its economic footholds. Moscow slips quietly into the middle. the third force that offers reassurance without rhetoric. Russia does not pretend to be Africa's savior. It offers something more subtle and seductive, a strategic partnership free from moral pretense. Over the past decade, Moscow has reemerged across Africa from Sudan to Mali, positioning itself as the guarantor of sovereignty against Western interference. In Nigeria's case, that message resonates. Russia can promise security, cooperation, energy deals, and political solidarity at the United Nations, all without lecturing Abuja about democracy or religion. It's a formula. Putin has perfected trade stability for influence, not ideology. Behind the scenes, Moscow will move in predictable but careful ways. It will coordinate closely with Beijing to craft a unified diplomatic front in the UN Security Council. A joint Sino-Russian declaration defending Nigeria's right to internal autonomy is almost inevitable. Russia will also offer to deepen military and counterterrorism cooperation, leveraging its experience in the Sahel and its growing presence through private contractors. To the Nigerian government, this will look like an insurance policy, a reminder that if Washington turns hostile, other partners will step in. Putin's broader aim is not to overshadow China, but to synchronize with it. Together, they can force the United States to fight on two diplomatic fronts at once, one in Africa and another in Asia. For Moscow, this is a strategic economy, maximum disruption at minimum cost. Every time Trump raises the temperature, Russia's position strengthens. Every time Washington threatens Russia, gains another partner seeking protection from Western coercion. To the West, Russia's role may seem opportunistic, even parasitic, but to much of the global South, it feels like balance a counterweight to a century of one-sided power. Moscow has learned the art of subtle legitimacy by presenting itself as the ally of nations under pressure. It turns America's moral language against itself. And so while the world fixates on Trump's bluster and China's resolve, Russia advances in silence, not with troops, but with patience, diplomacy, and timing. It doesn't need to win wars. It only needs to wait for the U.S. to exhaust itself trying to fight them all. When historians look back, they may say that Russia's greatest weapon was not its military, but its mastery of restraint. In a world where every empire speaks loudly, Moscow has discovered the strategic power of the whisper and the wisdom of letting others burn first. The confrontation over Nigeria has become more than a regional crisis. It is now a mirror reflecting the deep fracture of the international order. What began as a dispute over religious freedom has spiraled into a test of who truly governs the moral language of global politics. And as the dust settles, one truth emerges with clarity: the West no longer speaks for the world. Across Europe, governments are uneasy. Publicly, they echo Washington's concerns about China's growing influence in Africa. Privately, they worry about being dragged into another confrontation they neither started nor control. The European Union, still recovering from its economic stagnation and internal divisions, lacks both the moral confidence and the strategic capacity to act independently. The continent that once defined the age of empire now plays the role of anxious spectator trapped between the old loyalty to America and the new reality of multipolar power. In contrast, the global South reacts with unmistakable enthusiasm. From Latin America to Southeast Asia, Beijing's defense of Nigeria's sovereignty is being celebrated as a turning point, the moment when someone finally told the United States to stay out of another nation's business. African leaders, long accustomed to Western lectures, now see in China a model of diplomacy that respects dignity over doctrine. The applause at the United Nations is not just for Beijing, it's for the principle itself: let nations decide for themselves. This is where the moral tables turn. For decades, America wielded human rights as its sharpest tool, a justification for sanctions, invasions, and regime changes. But now the same concept rings hollow. The wars in Iraq and Libya, the economic strangulation of Cuba and Venezuela, and the selective silence over allied abuses have eroded Washington's credibility. The very idea that the U.S. can define virtue for the rest of the world now feels like an echo from a vanished century. Meanwhile, China and Russia have seized the moral vacuum. Their rhetoric of sovereignty and non-interference has become the rallying cry for nations tired of dependency. To Western ears, this may sound cynical. To others, it sounds like liberation. It's not that Beijing and Moscow are benevolent, they are strategic, but they understand something Washington has forgotten. Respect costs nothing, yet it earns everything. In the UN General Assembly, a quiet revolution unfolds. Countries that once voted out of fear of American retaliation now vote out of frustration with American arrogance. The world is not turning anti-American, it is turning post-American. The system that Washington built, Bretton Woods, NATO, the IMF, is still standing, but its moral foundations are crumbling. In this moment, Nigeria is not just a country, it is a symbol. It represents the shift from obedience to agency, from unipolarity to pluralism. As Beijing and Moscow defend their autonomy and Washington fumes, the rest of the world watches not to see who wins, but to see if the age of empire can finally lose. And for the first time in a century, the answer no longer depends on America. It depends on everyone else. History rarely announces its turning points with fanfare. More often, they arrive quietly through a single statement, a subtle refusal, or a line drawn by one nation that others never dared to cross. China's warning to Washington over Nigeria may be remembered as such a moment. It was not just a diplomatic rebuke, it was a declaration that the age of moral empire, the belief that one power could define virtue for the entire world, is over. For generations, the United States ruled not only through might, but through meaning. It claimed the moral vocabulary of freedom, human rights, and democracy, while often violating all three in practice. The paradox worked for a time because no one was strong enough to challenge it, but power, like belief, erodes when it becomes performative. The invasions, the sanctions, the endless preaching, they no longer inspire fear, they provoke fatigue. When China told America to stay out of Nigeria, it was not speaking only for itself. It was speaking for a world tired of asking permission to exist. The implications go beyond geopolitics. What is ending is not America's power. It still commands wealth, weapons, and allies, but its authority. The moral legitimacy that once underpinned U.S. dominance is crumbling, replaced by a chorus of nations demanding equality rather than obedience. China and Russia have not invented a new world order. They have merely exposed the exhaustion of the old one. Trump's defiance, his insistence that America must always lead, only accelerates this decay. His threats and bravado do not project confidence, they reveal insecurity. Empires rarely die from external enemies. They die from an inability to imagine a future that doesn't center on themselves. Washington's problem is not that others oppose it, but that others no longer believe it. Nigeria's crisis, in that sense, is less about Africa and more about the psychology of power. For centuries, the West viewed the global South as a canvas for its moral ambitions, but the canvas is now painting back. The nations once colonized, lectured, and exploited are now asserting the right to define their destinies and increasingly to reject the notion that virtue must speak English. The reckoning has begun not with war, but with awakening. The empire built on moral monopoly is giving way to a world of plural voices, each demanding to be heard. And perhaps that is not decline at all. Perhaps it is the first breath of balance. For if morality can no longer be dictated from above, it must finally be shared among equals. That, not domination, may yet be the true measure of civilization.